Hi, it's Rod Yates here. Welcome to Mastering Events, an Audience Republic podcast. Each episode, I'll be talking to some of the world's most accomplished event professionals to discover how they got where they are today, the lessons they've learned throughout that journey, and their insights around event marketing and maximizing ticket sales. My guest today is British music industry executive and artist and record producer manager, Stephen Budd. It's impossible to capture all of Stephen's accomplishments in this brief space, so I'm just going to list a few of them. In 2010, he co-founded the NH7 Weekender Festival in India, the first of its type ever in the country. In 2006, he co-founded Africa Express with Blur vocalist Damon Albarn and journalist Ian Birrell, a non-profit organisation facilitating collaboration between African, Middle Eastern and Western artists. Other festivals he co-founded include the DMZ Peace Train Festival in Korea, and he is a director of the award-winning OneFest Festival. He also created the Passport Back to the Bar's BRITs Week concert series, in which major artists like the Cure and Coldplay perform in small clubs across the UK to raise money for War Child. Add to all that an ongoing role with the Music Managers Forum, which he's been involved with since 1994 as both a chairman and board member, and the fact that the first producer he ever managed was the legendary Tony Visconti, and you start to get an idea of the width and breadth of Stephen's career. We try and cover as much as we can in this interview, starting with his first professional role in the music industry. I wanted to start just with your first paid job in the music industry. When you were working as a roadie for Motorhead at their first ever show at, I believe it was the Winning Post pub in Twickenham in 1975, and you were about 15 or 16. What can you remember of turning up to the venue that night and working their first ever show?
Well, I turned up in the afternoon because there was a sound check and they actually wanted to make it as a rehearsal, because literally it was their first. They played the night before, which I'd also roadied, which was just a jam, and that was at the Roundhouse in Camden. And then it was like, tonight we're playing our first headline show, which is at this pub, which was a bikers pub in Twickenham, which is famous for the rugby, of course, literally just a few hundred yards from the rugby stadium. It's still there, the pub, the Winning Post. I don't think they know what happened there back in the day. I remember turning up there at, 4:00 in the afternoon. I'd been asked to turn up. I was going to be the guy who just literally plugged in the amps and changed the guitar strings and did that kind of stuff. And the first thing I had to do was sound check and crawl under. They had a stage that was made out of Dexian, right? So Dexian is like Meccano, if you know what that is, right? And like bolted together little strips of metal with planks on top. So it was really rudimentary. And I went and crawled under the stage to plug in some plug boards of these amps that Lemmy had. He'd stolen all of Hawkwind's equipment, right? And he brought Hawkwind's equipment, nicked it out of the lockup in Ladbroke Grove, and driven it down to the Winning Post and dumped it on the stage. And I was under the stage plugging this stuff in, and one of the planks that Lemmy was standing on wasn't screwed down properly, and he put his foot on it, and the plank went into my back and cut a little 1-inch strip in my back. I was like, "Fuck!" Pardon my French. And then I crawled out from back under the stage, and he went, "You right, son?" I went, "Yes." A fucking thing went into my back, and he said, "Let's have a look." And he lifted up my shirt, and there was a 1-inch cut in my back. He said, "Oh, I think I better take you to the hospital." He drove me like half a mile to the hospital. They looked at it, stuck a butterfly thing over the thing. It didn't really need stitches. Went back to the gig and carried on with the sound check, which was about, they had planned to rehearse. So I'd interfered with the rehearsal, and it was Larry Wallace from the Pink Fairies on guitar and Lucas Fox on drums. So that was the original Motorhead. And that night, I thought, who's going to come? Be Hawkwind fans. But it was 200 bikers. So it was all Hells Angels and, like local bikers. And I'm standing there in the corner going, this is scary. and it was loud, and they just played covers, and they played this song Motorhead.
Right.
They played Motorhead, right? Which they played
Okay.
a couple of Pink Fairy songs, and they played this song Motorhead, which was a song that Lemmy had written whilst he was in Hawkwind, and that was it. Yeah, and that was the beginning of Motorhead. Day one, before
what an experience!
Before the t-shirts. Yeah.
How many days did it take for your ears to stop ringing?
I can't hear what you just said. 45 years later.
Yeah, that's it.
Remarkably, I managed to survive okay, so it wasn't too bad.
You had several experiences around that age. I think you were 15 when you stage managed the Watchfield Music Festival. Did you just have a natural confidence as a teenager to handle these situations?
It's a good question. I had a lot of chutzpah, and I was definitely used to being around people who were a lot older than me. And when I say a lot older than me, I mean they were still in their early 20s. The music business then was much younger. I mean, everything was much younger. Bands like, if you think about Free, Led Zeppelin, think of all these bands. They were 22. Like, what? So everybody was a lot younger, and I was DJing in a pub I was 14 years old when I was DJing in this pub, and people would take my music taste seriously, and as a result of that, I was like, it roped into this free festival organization. I'd been at the last Windsor Free Festival, which was in the Windsor Great Park behind Windsor Castle, totally illegal, pissed off the royal family, and they said, you guys have got to go. So they told the cops to get rid of us, and that was the third one in the third year that had been there. I'd only been at the third one. I was 13, and the cops just turfed everybody off, and then they said the next year they was like, you're not coming back here. And it was a Labour government at the time, and they wanted to not appear to be too horrible to the youth. So they discovered that the people who'd organised this festival worked out of this pub that I was the DJ at, right? So they sent along this Lord Melchit, real name, right? Not like Melchit as in Blackadder, but there was genuinely a real Melchit. And they sent him along and said, go and sort these hippies out. So he came and turned up, and he went, look, are you the guys who organised this festival? We went, might have been, And he went, look, if we give you some money and we give you a festival site free of charge, how about you don't do it in the Queen's backyard? And we said, how much? We said, how much money? And they said £100,000. And we were like, you've got to be kidding. That's more money than anybody's ever heard of, right? And so they gave us £100,000 and an old Second World War airfield in Swindon. Oh my God, totally unglamorous. And they let us be. And then we had a festival there for 3 weeks. And the people the guys I was with, Jex and various other people, they said, you can be the stage man. I was like, what? But they showed me what to do, and they showed me how a PA was set up, and they showed me how stuff was organised, and I was kind of like left alone to do it.
What impact do you think an experience like that had on your life?
Well, do you know what? I knew from age 10 or younger that I absolutely wanted to be involved in the music business. Well, I didn't know that it was called the music business, but I wanted to be involved in music, whatever happened. I was obsessive about Jimi Hendrix, and obviously when we were kids, we were all obsessive about the Beatles. But when I saw Jimi Hendrix on the Lulu show when I was 7, and I was like, okay, that was like, I've got to do this. So I was making myself fake guitars when I was like 8, 9 years old.
Right.
And then, very early on, decided that music was the career for me in one shape or form or another.
Okay.
And if I wasn't going to be a musician, then I was going to be something, anything.
Yeah. And you jumped headlong into it. I mean, obviously those experiences we've talked about, but at 19, you start a record label, then later move into managing artists and also managing producers. And I think you were one of the first people to actually manage producers and go and get producers their next gig.
Yeah.
One of those producers was, of course, Tony Visconti, the legendary Tony Visconti, who's worked with everyone from David Bowie to U2 to T-Rex to Thin Lizzy and keep on going down the list. Is there one particular session that you saw Tony work with that even to this day just strikes you as having been incredibly special?
I mean, there was lots of different sessions there. I was also running the studio, which was the first SSL studio in the world, actually. So for solid state logic studio with a computerized desk, those really didn't exist at that time. So, I mean, there's a couple of very funny stories around that studio, particularly. For some reason, this one is not particularly glamorous, but it's sticking in my mind when we made a Moody Blues album. And it was like a Moody Blues kind of comeback album. And these old war horses, Justin Hayward, lovely guy. There was just amazing people in the band. But I tell you one very, very funny thing that I nearly got sacked for. And I was in my early 20s, but I would come in every morning early to make sure that the studio was kind of like, because my office was behind the studio. And, I was running the studio and managing Tony. And managing Tony was one thing. We'll talk about that in a second. But running the studio was involved in running a studio, right? And I would come in early in the morning, make sure everything was set up and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, I'd come in so early in the morning and leave so late at night, as you do when you're a kid who's totally committed. I'd be exhausted, like knackered. So I had a habit, which was going into we had a kind of meeting room where you could go and eat your sandwiches type place. And there was a big table in there, and I would go under that table and just lie down and have half an hour's kip at lunchtime. Anyway, one day I'm lying under the table and I wake up and I can see all these feet around the table, right? And it's the Moody Blues having a meeting about how they were going to sack one of the band members who'd been there since day one, right? And I'm lying there listening to this thinking, they don't know I'm under here, right? And I'm thinking, how long do I stay under here? What do I do? I shouldn't be listening to this. But if I come up, they will know that I've been listening to this, right? If I stay under, it's even worse, right? I don't know what to do, So, that was a consequence of overwork and underpay. But I kind of decided to
what did you do?
I stayed under the table till they left. And I was a witness to sort of like the inner politics of how you sack band members. It was hilarious. But Tony, my role was really, as you touched on, there wasn't a culture of managing record, there wasn't an industry of managing record producers at that time. So my original thinking was, because he brought me in to run the studio, he couldn't work 30 days a month in that studio, 2 sessions a day. He had a addiction to buying extremely expensive equipment. The newest stuff that came out, I want that. I'll have 2 of those. And they go, Tony, they're like 20,000 quid each for a 1.5 second sampler. You really want 2 of them? Right. Yeah, I've got to have 2. It's like, okay. So the overhead's going up and up and up. So you think, well, we've got to keep this place going 24 hours a day. How do we do that? And I thought, well, if we manage record producers, if I manage some record producers, I can persuade them to work in the studio. That was the original idea. And then it became to start, well, what does managing a record producer mean? And it was effectively, I'll go and knock on doors of record companies and say, this guy would like to work with you, with this particular artist, And this was a very novel thing for record companies. They'd be going, what? Nobody's ever done this before, So I was like, it's like, you've got an artist, we like them, we've got a great studio and one of the greatest producers in the world. How about we work together? Like, It wasn't particularly complicated, but that was the beginning of it. And then very soon after that, I thought, well, if I could do it with Tony, I can do it with some others.
So how does that breadth of experience, having worked in live music, having had a record label, having managed artists and managed producers, you've got a really good, I guess, almost a 360 view of the industry. And then you start moving years later into organizing festivals and organizing live events. Oh, yeah. Did that breadth of experience, did that give you an advantage when it came to moving into that sphere, do you think?
Well, I mean, only to the extent that I didn't know what I was doing when I started running a studio. I didn't know what I was doing when I started managing record producers, and I didn't know what I was doing when I started working in live events, So right. I thought, well, I could get away with it that long, So at that point, I'd come out of working with... we're missing a lot of stuff in between because I'd been managing artists and I built up a big record producer management company and all the rest of it. And then eventually I merged my business with a company that had live music venues, or one live music venue. And then we built that up, and then we ended up with 10 live music venues, and they started some festivals and The Great Escape, which is a wonderful showcase event here in the UK, and various other things. And
what was that venue?
I thought, well, I'd like to do it.
That wasn't the Borderline.
We had the Borderline,
sorry, that wasn't the Borderline,
the Garage,
was it?
The Jazz Cafe, the Forum, and we eventually ended up with Hammersmith Apollo, which was definitely a step too far, because the whole business got taken over at that point. But we had some festivals, Lovebox and Wilderness festivals in the UK. So we started out of that group of companies. It was called Mama Group. Well, before that it was called Channel Fly, and then it became Mama Group, and I was a director of Channel Fly before it became the Mama Group. And I had come up with an insane idea of doing a festival in India, which they weren't particularly into the idea, but I thought, I'm going to do it myself. And I put the money up and brought a guy called Martin Albarn, who was the major booker of Glastonbury Festival. And the two of us put the money up for this, and working with a partner called Vijay Nair, amazing Indian guy, young promoter, who I'd met whilst on a trip to India to go and judge a competition, and realized that there was no festivals there. And at that time, we'd started a management company. I'd started a company called Supervision Artist Management, and we had Franz Ferdinand and the Kaiser Chiefs and various other people who were signed to the management company. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be amazing if we could bring these people out to India? Because there's definitely a market for it here, but the only acts that ever stop over there are Metallica and Sting. So, the three of us, Vijay, myself and Martin, went into partnership, set up this small festival, 5,000 people. Next year it was 10, next year it was 20. We started another one in Delhi, we started another one in Bangalore, we started another one in Hyderabad, and then we had 8, so it became quite a thing. And now, 15 years later, it's still going. It's been sold twice, but there are 2 big festivals there. The NH7 Weekender, it's called, one in Pune and one up in Shillong, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas. So it's a special thing that it's thriving.
Absolutely. What do you put that success down to? What did you get right that enabled you to grow it from 5,000 to 10,000 next year and so on, and for it to actually thrive? What were the key things that you got right?
Okay, so 3 things. Number one, obviously connecting with Vijay and a young, extremely enthusiastic but brilliantly talented promoter who had not been able to go out and promote proper events, and just giving him the leeway to do that. Everything was marketed through Facebook. There was no advertising. The first year, we didn't sell any tickets in advance at all. Right? People didn't trust that it was going to happen. They turned up on the day. When they saw the stages went up, they turned up. And 5,000 people turned up and paid cash.
Wow.
The second year, we could actually sell some tickets, So, and then, of course, the bookings. I helped in bringing in some of the international artists. So we had, Mark Ronson, Flying Lotus, The Wailers, Megadeth, Imogen Heap, The Vaccine, Cigarettes After Sex, Steve Vai, Steve Wilson, blah, 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 lots of interesting acts. So I could be a connector to those. And then there was this nascent scene in India of these incredible Indian EDM acts, Indian metal acts, Indian reggae acts, Indian indie acts, right? Plus some what you would now, we don't use the term anymore, but sort of world music acts that we would bring in. They were booking acts from Pakistan. They were, we had acts from Africa. The very first ever Afrobeat concert that ever happened in India was, we brought over Shayan Kuti, Fela Kuti's son, and Egypt 80 to play at the NH7 Weekender, So these are the things that changed the way that people were starting to view music in India. And that's been a great pleasure to have had that as part of, something that I've been involved in and love. Soon after that, before that, I had set up a big project for War Child, where we did a big charity series of events for War Child. The project was called Project Passport Back to the Bars. And the idea was you had major artists playing in small venues. In our case, we had the Barfly in London. It was a crazy idea I had to do with the Iraq War and raising money for children. And I did it with War Child to raise money for War Child. And, the first year we had The Cure, David Gray, Craig David, Sugar Babes, Amy Winehouse, Elbow, all of these people. And you think, how do you make any money out of that in a small club?
Right.
You can't, right?
Yeah.
And the idea was you did it as a lottery ticket. So you sold lottery tickets. And this has now become, it's called BRITs Week now here in the UK. And it happens in the week run up to the Brit Awards. And it's major artists playing in tiny little venues, but people buy lottery tickets to be one of the 200 people to see Coldplay playing in a pub. Those are the things that I got a lot of pleasure out of being involved with. Very different to managing artists, very different to managing record producers.
I guess one of the key things that managing artists and doing festivals perhaps has in common is that you both need to build an audience. An artist needs to build an audience, a festival needs to build an audience, and a loyal one at that. When you think about the festivals, beyond just putting on a good show, are there any other techniques that you have used or you've seen other festivals or artists use to actually build that audience and to grow that loyalty?
I think one of the best festivals I've been to, and I'm consistently going to each year that it happens, and they're two allied festivals, actually. Giles Peterson, who's a British DJ, he's kind of focused in the kind of where jazz meets urban music kind of crossover. And he created a festival initially in France called Worldwide, down in the south of France, where he was booking artists that blended all of those things. So you'd have Roy Ayers next to a drum and bass act, next to an amazing African artist from South Africa, with DJs as well and all that kind of thing. And it became quite a thing over a number of years. And there's an incredible amount of brand loyalty related to it. And he then recently, and when I say recently, 5 years ago, developed another festival called We Out Here, which is an outdoor festival in the UK, which has been focusing on that niche market. And I love niche markets. The niche is that whole London and British jazz thing that's come up, but mixing it with artists from America, some heritage acts and all the rest of it. And this has created something very, very special in my opinion, and has a lot of brand loyalty attached to it. So you create a brand and people will then go like, I'm going to come, I don't know who's playing next year, but I know I'm going to be there. And that is the ideal scenario. Not many people can do that. That won't work for Reading Festival, does work for Glastonbury. It won't work for Wireless, but it does for some of the niche kind of smaller genre-based festivals. So if you're a metalhead, There are metal festivals that you're just going to want to be at because it's your scene, To me, that's an interesting thing, that kind of niche approach, because, you are reaching out to like-minded people who want to be part of that experience,
That idea of finding that audience, I suppose, there's a marketing skill to that, obviously, and throughout all your experience running all these festivals and organizing these festivals, you must have worked with some amazing marketing people. What did you learn from these people about effective ways to market the festivals? Just clever tactics that they used to actually build that loyalty and build awareness and make people want to come to these shows.
I've sort of touched on it there. Really, it's about trying to, those people are the specialists in it. My role has been more about conceiving what the festival is in the first place, and coming up with the initial ideas. But the ones that have worked really well is about building a community. The NH7 Weekender were very, very good at it. A lot of detailed social media. It's nothing revelatory, I'm going to tell you. A lot of detailed social media interactivity, really making sure that the events that you created were captured properly, and that you've got a lot of content that you could repurpose during the year to build up in the pre-sale towards next year's event. Obviously, basic things like getting on sale as early as possible. But, creating an attraction and an identity relationship with the brand, rather than just waiting for who is the lineup. Lineups are important, especially with big festivals. But if you can, if you are in that position where, there is no one answer to this, because it's different in different places around the world. It depends how much your market is saturated. That Indian market that I'm talking about wasn't saturated at that point. Perhaps it's a bit more saturated now. And there's a lot of festivals happening there now. At that time, there was nothing, So we were the first, really. So it depends how mature the market is. The maturer the market is, in terms of number of events, and obviously the competition, then the more sophisticated mechanisms you're going to have to employ, and the harder it's going to be. I just think I was lucky to spot some gaps in the market in territories where there hadn't been so much activity. So I certainly wouldn't claim to be any marketing genius in relationship to making those festivals work. It's the right time in the right place.
Yeah. I mean, you think about some of the places where you've held festivals. You mentioned India, obviously, but, Africa, Palestine, you've put festivals on in these places. There must be some unique challenges which you face in these territories, which you wouldn't face in the UK, perhaps. Can you think of any sort of unique challenges that you faced in any of these areas and how you navigated them?
Each one has got its own challenges,
Sure.
I mean, going back to India, one of the key challenges was, could we find enough decent equipment to put on a festival, decent staging, festival staging? Yeah, at that time, it didn't really exist, When we found our first festival site, and obviously I'm in the UK, my partners are in India, this is pre-Zoom, but we're talking via... like fairly dodgy mobile connections, and then I'm going out there every month or two, and finding a site, and then realizing I'd made the mistake of not really having looked at the site design properly, to the extent that there was a fucking motorway running through the middle of the site, And we had one stage on one side of the motorway and another stage on the other side. And I said, I'm sure we had said that we were going to face it all this way. And he said, yeah, but you can't do that because the sun comes up here and it's going to cause a problem with it. And I was like, but there's a fucking motor. How are people going to get from... You just run across the motorway. What are you talking about? I was like, what? People run across the motorway? Yeah. So that's what happened. And I was like, please, nobody die. And then walking behind the stage and seeing the original electricity boxes, the fuse boxes, when you look at them, you're going, somebody's going to absolutely fry here, right? Health and safety, you don't want to think about it. But nobody died, right? Everybody survived
Right.
and had an amazing time. And then literally within the space of 2 years, suddenly the equipment was amazing. And everything just upgraded and upgraded and upgraded and upgraded until, we were running a festival and in India where you would walk onto the site and think, you could close your eyes and go like, oh, I'm at Lovebox, or I'm at Field Day, or I'm at, Wilderness. But you were in India, right?
Right.
So the level of everything was absolutely the same and brilliant, So things rapidly accelerated, and largely, again, thanks to the incredible people in India who managed to pull all this together, because certainly I wouldn't have had the capability of doing that, in that way, long distance, especially when you're dealing with the politics,
I just wanted to talk to you about another of the amazing initiatives which you founded or co-founded, which was Africa Express in 2006, which you co-founded with Damon Albarn and the journalist Ian Birrell, which I guess it's designed to facilitate cross-cultural collaboration between Western artists and African artists. And there have been myriad amazing performances that have been put on over the years, but there was one in particular I just wanted to talk to you about, which was that 2012 activation where you took a diesel train around the UK with about 80 artists on it for a week, and you would sort of perform pop-up shows along the way in prisons and schools. What do you recall of those train rides with that many musicians in between the shows?
It was fairly stressful, but it was absolutely, it's one of those experiences that you take to your grave. It was part of the Olympics in 2012 when the Olympics was in the UK. And if you know, when you have an Olympics, you also have a cultural Olympics alongside it, right? So there was budget, And Ian, who's the sort of major domo and co-creator with Damon, went to the Cultural Olympics and said, listen, we've got an idea. We came up with this mad idea. We were called Africa Express, and we've been going for 6 or 7 years. And we thought, why don't we do a train? And the idea, we went to the Olympics and said, how about we take a train around because they were keen on getting the Olympics outside of London and taking it to the regions in some kind of way, right? How about we take a train around the UK, we fill it with musicians from Africa and the UK and America and various other countries, and we put on shows around the UK. And they went, oh, that's a great idea, we love it. And then we had, then we got to, but then we was like, okay, how the hell do we organize this? And of course, we had to find a train, and organize that. And of course, the train companies were like, you want to take 80 musicians around the UK on a train? You're talking about musicians who smoke drugs, right? Musicians who drink, those kind of musicians. And we were like, yeah, actually. It's like, nope, no. And then eventually we found this train company who hauled nuclear waste, right? And they were insane enough to agree to do this with us. And we created this, we had the carriages, I think it were the old Orient Express carriages, but 2 of them we gutted and turned them into rehearsal carriages. And we had 80 music. We had, John Paul Jones from Led Zeppelin. We had the Yeah Yeah Yeahs. We had the Libertines. We had the Noisettes. We had them with Baba Mal, Amadou and Mariam, Fatimata Diawara, Rokia Traore, all these incredible people. And we would rehearse on the train, Tony Allen. We would rehearse on the train. And then that night we would go out and put on a spontaneous show, rehearsed on the train, but, one day of rehearsal. Yeah, and we built circus tents and festival. And at the front of the train, we had this. I'm going to show it to you. Can you see that?
Ah, yeah, I can see that. The Africa Express sign. Yep.
That's it. That was on the front of that train, driving around
that's great.
The country. So, yeah, and then Paul McCartney came and joined us on the last day. We built a festival site behind King's Cross Station. He turned up from Paris. and then walked round the corner carrying his Hofner bass and turn up and we'd been rehearsing some Wings songs. We decided not to do any Beatles songs, so we rehearsed some Wings songs. He played a set of Wings songs with all these amazing African artists. So yeah, that's Africa. That was one of the Africa Express adventures. We had many. We went to Mali twice, Nigeria, Ethiopia, South Africa,
Yeah.
put on shows at Roskilde, Glastonbury, all over the world, and it's been a life-changing experience making albums and movies and everything. It's a not-for-profit thing.
The satisfaction of seeing that come to fruition must be overwhelming. Do you allow yourself moments when you're witnessing things such as that to actually step back and just consider what you've organized there, what you've achieved?
Generally speaking, you're in such a point of view of tiredness and exhaustion, right? But there's certainly been moments where you stand there and go, wow, this is amazing. It's when you see an audience reacting and there's thousands of people just really enjoying themselves and like having an experience which they just couldn't have had elsewhere because it's absolutely unique. It's not like this is coming back around again. Oh yeah, we'll be able to see this next year. It's like if you weren't there, you weren't there. You know what I mean? So you're having a one-off experience and seeing that is special. And you go like, yeah, God, amazing to have been a part of this, really.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting point about how special those experiences are. When you think of the festivals you've organized or the festivals that you've just been to, how important is it, do you think, for these festivals to have a story to tell? So you've spoken, for example, about the NH7 Weekender being, certainly the first indie music festival in India, and another one of your festivals, OneFest, I believe, is very big on local producers in the wheelchair region, really sort of championing that element of the festival. How important is it, do you think, that a festival does have a story to tell like that, or a unique proposition?
Well, I think it's important. For me, any of the live music projects that I've got involved with, I'm not doing it because I just think it's going to make money. A lot of people do, nothing wrong with that. It's like, here's a commercial proposition. Oh, we spotted a gap in the market. Let's do that. But that's not my motivation. My motivation is to have an experience. And I think it probably stems out of those kind of like I'm going to sound like such a wanker, but transcendental experiences I felt like I had at certain moments at free festivals when I was a kid, when you're just standing there going like, I haven't paid a penny for this. I'm standing in a field with a bunch of hippies who are off their faces watching some of the most amazing music of all time. What's not to like, And that's the thing that I've wanted to have a version of that involved in the different, live music experiences that I've been involved with. I still go out and see live music 4 times a week. In London, we're extremely blessed. So I'm seeing hundreds of bands, hundreds of artists every year, and it's those ones that can take you somewhere else and give you something that you just can't get from listening to the radio or from, being in a club. Well, you can get it from being in a club, right? But, that direct one-on-one experience with live musicians where they're on the edge of their seat and things could go wrong, but yet they produce something magnificent, and it's those kind of moments.
Stephen, just last couple of things. I just wanted to take a quick left turn into when you were chairman of the Music Managers Forum. And one of the issues that you campaigned against was the secondary ticketing market, and particularly, I guess, unscrupulous touts. What's your take on the secondary market now? Have you seen any improvements? Where do you sit with secondary ticketing now?
It's different in different parts of the world, but in the UK, there's been some significant improvements in the way that secondary ticketing has been regulated. Meaningful changes. I mean, it doesn't mean that abuses still don't happen, but that it's an ongoing campaign, and every once in a while, it brilliantly run by the MMF and the whole MMF team and various other individuals involved in it, and certain key managers, people like Ian McAndrew who manages the Arctic Monkeys, have been absolutely central in that whole thing. And they've had meaningful results. You know, a lot of the promoters have got on board. People like Kilimanjaro, you know, Ed Sheeran's promoter, have really stepped up to the plate, and you know, because it was a profit center for slightly corrupt promoters, slightly corrupt artists as well. You know, who would abuse their own audiences. You know, and I mean, I don't want to sound holier than thou, you know, but certainly, I think it was a very, very valid campaign that the MMF, Music Managers Forum, has run for a number of years. And it's really kind of, you know, made a significant difference.
Yeah. Are there any other issues that you think are particularly pressing in the live events sphere?
Two of the key issues I would say are, you know, and people doing great work on them, starting to make meaningful change. Obviously, there's key change, which is the movement which is around wanting to have a far greater representation of female performance generally in festival events, you know, and keeping that pressure up. I think that's really important. And then on the climate change side, I think there isn't a festival out there who isn't aware of, you know, trying to mitigate the effect that they're having on climate change, pollution, etc., etc. So, you know, these are two things that I think have, you know, anyone who has a heart, as the song went, you know, wants to make a difference to. and they are, you know, and I think that's one thing that the festival community as a whole can be kind of proud of.
Yeah. Last thing, Stephen, you spoke earlier about the fact that as you got into managing, as you got into live events, as you got into running a record label, you didn't know what you're doing. You kind of had to learn, I suppose, through trial and error. But were there any mentors earlier in your career that really passed on some sage advice, or just mentors that you could confide in when issues came up?
I wish I could say they were. No.
Okay.
That doesn't mean, I don't want to say like that, well, I can pat myself on the back on that, because I made more mistakes than I made right moves, you know. But right. You know, unfortunately for me, there wasn't. I could probably, if I had been less sort of frantic, I could probably sort some out and maybe had that period. But do you know what? I was impossible to work with. You know, I always wanted to do everything myself. You know, so it was like, okay, you know, in order to have a mentor, you'd probably have to have an ongoing working kind of relationship with them. And you know, I was kind of very much, I've got to do this myself kind of vibe. So, you know, I made an amazing amount of mistakes, an amazing amount of errors. But, you know, luckily enough, I stayed on the pitch long enough that you stay on the pitch long enough, a ball is going to bounce off you and into the goal, right?
Yes, that's true. You know, that's true.
So I mastered the art of staying on the pitch.
Well, Stephen, that was so fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. I really appreciate it.
Pleasure.